Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Best Practice Approaches for Interviewing Clients Who Have Experienced Trauma. I'm Sarah Mancall, the Policy Director with the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues. We are a division of the American Psychological Association. And a little bit about today's webinar organizers. This webinar is the third of several that is being sponsored by the American Psychological Association Committee on Division/APA Relations, a funded grant project on immigrant and refugee advocacy. So it's a number of APA divisions across the field of psychology. We're very excited about today's topic and a little bit about our presenter. Before transitioning to a career in the law, Jeff Kagan Trenchard taught creative writing in high-need schools, foster care centers, and jails for over 10 years. He regularly facilitates trainings on how to work with clients who have experienced trauma and how to use literary techniques in legal writing. He is currently a staff attorney for the New York City AntiViolence Project and works extensively with the New Sanctuary Coalition's Free Legal Clinic. Jeff is going to present today, and then we'll have a Q&A and hopefully get around to some of your questions, and he'll also be providing his contact information in case we don't get to all of those questions. Please type your questions into the question box as attendees are muted. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Jeff.
Morning, everyone. How's everybody doing? Or afternoon, I should say. Sarah, you're able to see my screen? Because I'm not able to get my camera working. So am I just able to be a disembodied voice, or do I need to click more things in order to have a camera pop up?
There is a webcam little drop-down menu on the right-hand side. So if you see it, it's just above audio.
Yeah, I see it, and it's always in front, and it's not detecting it. So.
Okay.
I think I just might have to be the great and powerful Oz here, and now we'll just be the voice behind the curtain. But I'm eminently Googleable if you're wondering what I look like, for all of you out there. First, thank you so much for taking the time to be a part of this today. So, like Sarah said, before I became a lawyer, I taught creative writing mostly with young people who are in some pretty difficult situations. I often joke that I've basically been doing the same job for about 20 years, which is I sit in small rooms with people and they tell me horrible things. I then write those things down, and hopefully something positive will come from that writing. Or at one time it was poems and sometimes like personal essays and things like that for my students, and now it's affidavits and declarations, mostly for people who are seeking asylum. At AVP, I'll talk about it in a moment. I work with LGBTQ asylum seekers, as well as people looking for relief under the Violence Against Women Act and sort of other humanitarian relief. So I also do a fair amount of work with people who are victims of intimate partner violence, so getting orders of protection, things like that. I'm a lot of fun at a cocktail party. It's very, very chill, very, very happy person. So today is what I put together. This training I usually do for attorneys. So there's going to be some stuff here that may not apply necessarily to your clinical practice, but I hope there are some things that are useful. I hope also in some of the things that I talk about, it becomes, I would imagine a lot of you are working with attorneys in tandem to prepare declarations, affidavits, expert testimony, things like that. This will also hopefully give you a little bit of insight into attorney culture and some of the things that are going on in my particular arm of the octopus. So, all right, let me get started. Checklist. You're gonna move the slide. There we go. Back it up one. All right, cool. So I work for the New York City AntiViolence Project. We empower gay, lesbian, and bisexual, transgender, HIV-affected communities, really addressing all forms of violence. We also have a counseling service that is really amazing and runs a 24-hour hotline for people who cannot call 911. The number is there at the bottom. And you can find out more about us at avp.org. We also do a lot of great community organizing and work with a national anti-violence project. So if you're interested in getting involved, drop a line to me personally or to AVP. Here's my learning objectives for today. My hope is that you're able to, after today, be able to recognize some of the common physical and behavioral signifiers of trauma. What does trauma look like when you see it show up for someone? The goal is also to consistently create an environment where a person who's experienced trauma is able to discuss their experience. In my practice, very rarely is it ever a one and done kind of situation. For the most part, I'm seeing people 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 times before we are able to actually finish a declaration for them. So it's really about creating a kind of continuum of care that people are dealing with in order to help them, be able to talk about what they need to talk about. I also spend quite a bit of time at the end talking about the effects of working in a high trauma environment. This section is very much oriented around legal culture, but I feel like some of the things I talk about may be playing at a theater near you if you are a clinician and you are doing this kind of work. So I'll go over it, and also I think can give you a pretty good insight as to what it's like to be an attorney right now, and will hopefully be helpful for those of you that are working with attorneys. Here we go. Here's my agenda. I'm going to start with a very quick discussion about trauma in the brain. Sorry, I need to take a sip of water. A lot of this stuff will be might be pretty old hat for some of you as clinicians, but I'm just going to go over it pretty quickly for those of you who maybe don't do a lot of trauma-oriented practice. I also am incapable of reading Trauma in the Brain written out like this and not sing it to the tune of Pinky in the Brain. Don't know if any of that is showing up for anyone who's on the call right now, but it's trauma in the brain. Next, I'll talk about setting the stage, ways that you can help your clients get ready to do this kind of an interview and this kind of an interaction, as well as how to sort of set up the physical space itself while you'll be doing the interview in order to help kind of bring about the best result for your clients. After that is doing the thing, which is also my Legends of Korra, Avatar: The Last Airbender reference, which you would be surprised rings out really, really heavy in legal circles. There's a pretty heavy Venn diagram between anime fans and lawyers. You would be surprised. Doing the thing is really getting into discussing the traumatic episode and how to sort of take care of your client after that. After that, I do a checklist review, just a quick overview of kind of all the things we discuss. And then I'll talk a little bit about how to sustain, how to sort of keep yourself more or less together while you're doing this kind of work. All right. Okay, so why is this important? I often have to sort of explain the value of this sort of thing to senior partners, executive directors, stuff like that, who sometimes regard, feelings as not really being that important necessarily to the kind of work that we do. So the Dan Siegel quote, I think, really kind of sums it up, which is, "Our minds can turn even neutral comments into fighting words, distorting what we hear to fit what we fear." All too often, I have seen situations in which attorneys are not able to have a positive interaction in a relationship with their clients. There's excessive sort of discord and disagreement when there really doesn't need to be. And a lot of it, I think, often comes down to microaggressions and small sort of social infractions that oftentimes the attorneys don't even realize that they're doing. But they're talking to people who are in such a heightened state because they are afraid of what is currently happening in their life, and they are also very traumatized by the things that they have experienced. So this is a quote by Lauren Nader, who's an anthropologist, I believe, still at UC Berkeley. And I heard this quote when I sat in on one of her lectures when I was dating my now partner, because I didn't have anything to do that day, and they were going to their, anthropology class. And I heard this quote, and it's really stuck in my teeth and been with me kind of ever since. There's no word in the English language for the opposite of paranoia. There's no way to say that you are appropriately afraid of people actually out to get you. And I feel like this sums up the experience of pretty much every person in the United States right now who's not a U.S. citizen. If you're not a U.S. citizen, I will tell you it is in my professional opinion that you have something to worry about. If you're a legal permanent resident, if you're an asylum seeker, if you're married to a U.S. citizen but have not adjusted your status, if you're undocumented, you are appropriately afraid of people actually out to get you. If you are a person of color in this country, regardless of how much your family feels very much part of the collective American experience, The tenor of white nationalism in this country and white supremacy in this country should tell you that you are appropriately afraid of people actually have to get you. If you identify as LGBTQ, or identify just as someone who's not enthusiastic about kind of violently enforced patriarchy, you should be really worried, and you are appropriately afraid of people actually out to get you. We have a executive branch that is enthusiastically homophobic, and will go so far as to try and throw people out of the military for no good reason if they identify as transgender. So any anxiety, any darkness, any fear, any looking over your shoulder that you're experiencing is very well warranted, and even more so, your client's fear is very well warranted. I think it's really important to keep this kind of front of mind when we're talking about what's going on, because the trauma doesn't exist just in their past; it is an ongoing experience for them right now. So first, we're going to talk about trauma and the brain. Again, for clinicians, some of this might be just kind of review, but often I have to explain to lawyers that emotions are really, really real. So first, I like to start with the APA's definition of trauma. This is a somewhat problematic definition in my opinion, but I think it is a really good place to start. So, trauma is an emotional response to a terrible event like accident, rape, or natural disaster. Shock and denial are typical, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the problem I have with this definition of trauma is that it orients the experience of trauma as being discrete, as being based on an accident, rape, or natural disaster. I get into later complex post-traumatic stress disorder and things like that, but I think that it's important to understand that even our language around discussing trauma is unfortunately very infused with a very particular perspective. That we don't automatically account for the experience of what it's like to live in kind of a perpetual state of traumatic arousal, for what it's like to be a person of color or a gender nonconforming or an LGBTQ identifying person in this country, or a person without legal status. The definition I like a little bit more is going to come up momentarily. There we go. Trauma is the subjective experience of objective events, right? If you believe you to be in danger, the more traumatized you will become. It's the overwhelming emotion of utter helplessness that sort of signifies the trauma. Ta-Nehisi Coates is a great line in Between the World and Me, his book Between the World and Me, where he talks about being jumped by a bunch of people in Baltimore and beaten up in the street, and the experience of his body or his soul kind of like almost separating from his body and like seeing his body as not a thing that was under his control anymore. And I thought that was a very beautiful and really poetic and really appropriate definition of what trauma is like. I think this definition is also really important because it's the subjective experience of objective events. So someone may be more traumatized by a thing that was not as life-threatening per se, right? There can be certain things that really stick with them more than the things that literally could have killed them. Now, also, it's important to realize that you can't actually compare the severity of trauma based on the severity of the event in the person's life, right? Like just because one person had a gun pulled on them and the other person was shot, it doesn't necessarily mean that the person was shot actually experiences a greater degree of trauma around that issue. It's very, very personal in terms of how we understand what has happened to us. All right. Now, post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD versus trauma, I like to take a little bit of time when I'm talking with attorneys to split these out so that there isn't sort of an automatic conflation and not an over-pathologization of people who've experienced trauma, right? It is very natural to feel afraid during and after a traumatic situation, but people who have PTSD feel stressed or frightened when they are no longer in danger. The analogy or the sort of real-world example that I like to use in this situation comes from my mother-in-law. As an example, difference between PTSD and trauma. So my mother-in-law is from where I am broadcasting live, New York State. She grew up in East Meadow, Long Island, went to nursing school in Rochester, where she met her future husband, who then moved back to Los Angeles, where his family was. They had several children, one of which went on to become my partner. In the 1994 Northridge earthquake, a tree came down and split their house in two. Split their house into many parts, really, but definitely chopped into their youngest child's room and had the child been sleeping in the bed, they would have very likely have been killed. Now, I don't know if anyone listening here has had the experience of talking to a person from the East Coast after they experienced an earthquake, but there are a few things that anyone hates more than an East Coast person in the United States hates: earthquakes, and is very, very disturbed by them. As a native Californian, I shrug off anything, that's not bigger than a 5.0. But this very, very much affected my mother-in-law, who's also a nurse and a nurse educator. So, every car she ever rides in, or her children ride in, or her grandchildren ride in, is got all of the earthquake preparedness, everything. There's lots of bottles of water. There's plenty of first aid kits. There's the shiny space blankets that are used in emergencies and marathons. I'm not sure why both, but it's got, we always roll deep with all of our supplies. Also, everything is bolted appropriately to the walls, et cetera, et cetera. This was an example of trauma in her life, but did not result in post-traumatic stress disorder. This is a somewhat adorable, natural, and appropriate adaptation to the things that she has experienced. This is not PTSD, at least the way that she has described it to me, in my opinion. PTSD, someone suffering from PTSD would have to move away from California, or feel like they had to, or would not be able to get into a building that was higher than 3 or 4 stories, right? While Freud is obviously a very problematic figure as well, I do think that the idea that a fundamentally healthy psyche is one where people are able to work and to love, as he sort of opines at one point. And I think that a way to identify when someone's really dealing with a post-traumatic stress disorder kind of situation is when they're unable to operate in some basic functions in their life. But that is distinct from trauma. I also talk a little bit about complex PTSD, again, because, I think that is a somewhat more accurate assessment, at least of my client base. The folks that I'm working with, I've been doing LGBTQ-focused asylum work for about 5 years now, and I would say less than 5% of the clients I've ever worked with did not experience sexual violence and sexual assault as a child or as an adult. Nearly all of them experienced some degree. I would say 99% of them experienced some sort of child abuse or child abandonment. And they experience what is often diagnosed as complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which, as you all know, is a little bit different than PTSD, but has a lot to do with sort of a rupture of fundamental trust and experience in the world generally, that often accompanies adverse childhood experiences and other similar situations. Right. So this is something that I, and hopefully none of the clinicians on here will tell me this is a bad article. I'm realizing this now, that some of you may find this article to be completely not true, but I find this is a really great way to kind of break attorneys out of their thinking that our brains and our sense of self really exists as like a Google Drive or a Dropbox outside of our physical bodies. This is a great article in Wired from a couple of years ago that talks about how, it's got all the good body keeps the score stuff, right? And like all of that MRI made available research where, your sensory experiences trigger molecular changes in your brain. So wondering why someone just can't get over what happened to them when they were 6 is like wondering why someone just can't get over their peanut allergy or their cancer diagnosis. It's like, come on, Tim, like still back to the anaphylactic shock, right? That would be a horrible and ridiculous thing to say. But this is something I really try and make clear to attorneys, because we have a lot of ideas in legal culture around this kind of brain-body separation that is also reaffirmed through a lot of our legal culture in kind of implicit and sometimes explicit ways. But people's brains are literally changed by their experiences. And so we need to account for that in the same way that we would account for a physical change in capacity by what's going on. I also do a quick overview of Dan Siegel's hand-brain model, right? The way in which we literally, quote, flip our lid when the neocortex, kind of goes offline during a traumatic episode. And I talk a lot about how when someone is experiencing that kind of traumatic episode, they're unable to sort of get at the linguistic functionality that happens in the prefrontal cortex. It's like asking someone to take a math test when they just got out of a car accident. And unfortunately, the nature of my work is to get people to this sort of heightened upset state. And then we go in and try and get these really, really gruesome specific details in order to talk about their experience and to be able to show and prove that they are experiencing and they're going through what they are. All right, I'm sorry, my computer's going to be making a lot of noises at us. I'll try and keep it to a minimum. All right, so here's some recognizing reactions to adrenaline, right? These are from a somatic therapist that I work with in a professional capacity. That I've lectured with Caroline quite a bit around like how to work with young people and students who've experienced trauma. And this is some of the stuff that she's noticed. People become increasingly like, and this almost follows like a fight, flight, freeze / fawn kind of breakdown of adrenaline response, right? Like people become unnecessarily loud, they lose physical boundaries, they cry for quote no reason. Oftentimes people can't remember what happened in an interview. I'm sure as clinicians you've had the experience of seeing your clients. I know that I've had the experience as a client working with my mental health professionals where I really need a what happened on the last episode breakdown because I honestly don't remember what's happening or what had happened in the sessions after I leave them. Those parts of the brain just kind of tune out because of the tremendous amount of adrenaline that is flowing through me or us when these things happen. All right, so, key points. Not all people who have experienced trauma have PTSD. Trauma is a subjective experience. There is no better or worse than trauma. And trauma and PTSD can alter your physical body and your literal brain. This, I feel like, is such an important thing, not only to point out to attorneys that I work with and other colleagues, but also to really point out to my clients who just can't seem to understand why they're so upset all the time. That, they don't quite always realize that their physical body has been altered and changed by the things that they've experienced. And that experience needs to be honored and recognized. All right. Going on to questions. Oh, shoot. Sorry, my connection is going a little fast. I think I'll go through, like Sarah mentioned, I usually do questions as we're going, but maybe I'll just save them all to the end. I presume all 45 of the attendees are okay with that. If you have a thing that is truly pressing and you feel like it's going to be like impossible for you to continue without that question being answered, go ahead and type it in. I am shrinking or minimizing my little screen here that shows me that questions happen now. But I'll go back and check it when I get to the question prompts at each kind of interval in each section. I'm going to presume you're all okay with that because we're unable to. I don't see anything back, so I'm just going to keep it moving. All right. A very slow computer. All right. Hide control panel. And there. Boom. Come on. There we go. Maybe. Oh, there we go. Okay. Come on. All right. Setting the stage. You can't go from 0 to the worst thing ever in 60 seconds. Is the subtitle. Okay. We are creating an experience for our clients, right? We are often, as I mentioned earlier, the things we actually do are not going to be remembered, and the things we discuss are actually not going to be remembered. But people forget what you said, they forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. There's a great Maya Angelou quote that I hold with me all of the time. Especially because people are often only having like a vague recollection of how they felt walking out of our offices. I think it's really important to remember that they need to feel comfortable walking back in. Otherwise, they're going to be apprehensive when they come in, and that's going to make it harder for all of us to get to the place that we're trying to get to. Sorry, my computer connection is so very slow. Come on, slide. There we go. So before the interview begins, always consider the room. Okay, so how is the room set up, particularly where is the door? This is important because very often people who are seeking asylum or have dealt with trauma generally have been trapped. They've been stuck in situations that they were not able to get out of. So offering people seats near the door, letting people, like, making it very clear that you're not like physically blocking their egress is really good. Also making sure that they know their way around the office can be very important if you have a larger office that you're working in. Also, do you have tissues, water, and then gum and mints is something I always like to keep on hand. Something I've found both in my personal experience and in my professional experience. People, when they get huge surges of adrenaline, their mouths tend to get very dry. And then they get into this negative feedback loop of where your body's like, my mouth is dry. I wonder if that means I need to just turn on the adrenaline function. Oh, the adrenaline function is going, hey, the mouth is still dry, but turn on more adrenaline. And it starts really kind of developing and pushing this very negative feedback loop. And in order to help people kind of get broken out of that, sometimes just a change in taste in their mouth, so they can like chew some gum, chew some mints, have some water. That can really, really help them get grounded again. Also, is there a visible clock? Not knowing the time is disorienting. That's why there's no clocks in casinos. Also in a lot of courtrooms and court waiting rooms and asylum waiting rooms. Asylum office waiting rooms don't have clocks, which can be really disorienting and stress producing. This is, I think, one of the most poetic sentences ever written by a former chairman of the Metropolitan Transit Authority. In New York, we have like recently in whenever this was about 2010, we have clocks that tell us when the subway is coming, which vastly improved all of our experience on the subway. Because we've all had the experience, every one of us getting down to the subway and not knowing what is happening, literally looking longing down the tracks to see if we can see a white light. So we'll talk more about this later, but like letting the client know how long the session is going to be, how long you're going to be waiting for the next session, how long the legal remedies are going to take, can be invaluable in de-escalating the stress your client is under. Even if you don't know the times, like letting them know approximate times, or that you don't know how long these things are going to take, can at least let your client know that they're not alone in this anxiety. All right, so particularly for trans and GNC, GNC is the acronym for gender nonconforming. So some people identify as a lot of the terms, if you're not familiar, that I'm going to use when talking about gender and sexuality are very new terms and new terminology. There's been an incredible increase in the amount of nuance and the amount of specificity that people are able to discuss their gender and their sexual orientation, which is is a very new revelation. It doesn't mean that these identities did not exist before, but we now have some collective language in order to discuss them. So transgender typically refers to people who are born or assigned, male or female at birth, and then at some point, sometimes very young, sometimes adolescent, sometimes when they get older, realize that their internal sense of gender identity does not match with their external expression. Some people take some steps to alter that exterior. Some people don't for various reasons that have to do with money and safety and a lot of things that are outside of their control. Gender nonconforming is sometimes also used in the trans context for people that maybe present or that maybe identify as one gender, but have certain aesthetic attributes that are not typified with that gender. So women who grow facial hair, right? Men that have very delicate or, what are considered to be unmasculine features, right? Or maybe appear in a somewhat gender liminal or gender ambiguous way, sometimes refer to themselves as gender nonconforming because they do not fit neatly into one box or the other. So you should definitely be doing safety planning around your building, specifically around two areas, around bathrooms and security protocols. So do you have gendered or gender neutral bathrooms, right? And if so, where are those bathrooms? And have you made it explicitly clear to your client that they're allowed to use whichever bathroom they feel comfortable in? This is a constant navigation and negotiation that trans and GNC people deal with, which causes them quite a lot of stress. I think it's really important to understand that the bathroom laws banning trans people from using the bathroom of their choosing because of because of supposed safety concerns are completely misguided in that more often than not, it's the trans or gender nonconforming person who feels the violation of physical safety when they're in said bathroom. But when you're making it difficult for people to use the bathroom when they are out in public, you are curtailing their ability to engage in public and civil life, right? You are making it impossible for them to just go about the daily business of being in the world. So whatever we can do to acknowledge that tremendous difficulty they are dealing with all the time and make our spaces as safe as possible, we have an affirmative duty to do that, in my opinion. as clinicians, as lawyers, as people who want to show up in allyship and accompliceship. With that, you should also be really clear about the security processes in your building. I work with a lot of people at larger law firms that usually have a security protocol when they go in. Very often, I'm introducing them to clients whose identification documents do not accurately represent their current gender presentation. And this can make for a very traumatic, difficult experience for them just trying to get through security. So you don't want to create a situation in which your client is stressed out and offended and hurt even before they're even able to get into your building. So meeting your clients down in the lobby and then walking them through to make sure that they aren't going to have to deal with metal detectors, body scanners, a very well-meaning security guard who maybe asks a few too many inappropriate questions, right? Head that one off at the pass and make sure that your clients feel comfortable when they're coming into the space. Next. There we go. This was something that I saw on Twitter around academics who work with people who have spectrum issues or, deal with autism and other things like that. Taking a picture of the room itself can sometimes be really helpful for people working with autism. Also, taking pictures of the outside of your building, or if you're meeting, like I meet clients a lot of times in train stations and then they go to our asylum office interview. Taking pictures and sending those pictures can be incredibly helpful in making sure that they're able to just have a little bit of a calm in walking into the building in the first place. Excuse me. A lot of the law firms that I work with are in Midtown Manhattan, and all of those buildings look very, very similar. So I try and take a picture of the building itself when I'm telling a client who's going to that building for the first time. All right, now this is something that I learned from my mother-in-law, which is a nursing protocol or a hospital worker protocol that I think is so useful in my work and can be very, very useful in your work. So the acronym is pronounced ADIT, which is acknowledge, introduce, duration, explanation, and thank you. Apparently, this is the protocol that should be done every time you go into a hospital setting when you're sitting in an inpatient capacity, and you a hospital employee, nurse, orderly, technician comes into the room. They're supposed to acknowledge your presence and let you know that they see you there. Introduce themselves, talk about the duration of the process, explain what's going on, and thank you for being there. So, hello, my name is Patty Shalavutis. I am your phlebotomist. I am here to phlebotomize your phlebotoms. It's going to take about 30 minutes to make sure that everything is in phlebotomastical working order. The purpose for this is to ensure that all of your phlebotomy systems are running appropriately and your organs can phlebotomize to their hearts or liver's content. Thank you so much for your time today. Do you have any questions? Now, obviously, I just like saying phlebotomy over and over again as that example, but the way that I use this practice in my work is to always, when I'm meeting a new client, say, hello, my name is Jeff. I am an attorney, and I'd love to talk to you today a little bit about your immigration case. I have about an hour planned for us. During that time, I mostly just want to know when you came into the United States, and I want to make sure all of your information is correct. There are some things that can change about your immigration case and your options depending on when and how you came into the U.S. So that's really the focus of today. If you'd like to tell me about some of the things that you've been through, I would absolutely love to hear them, but that's something we're going to talk more about next session. Today is only going to be about an hour, and we're just going to kind of cover your name and your address and some basic things about how you came into the U.S., and then we're going to plan for next time. If you need to leave early for any reason, please let me know, or if things get difficult, we can absolutely reschedule. Thank you so much for coming in today. Right. So it doesn't necessarily need to hit all of these food groups in this order, but you should be hitting all of them, I think, in every interaction you have with your client. Hey, thanks so much for coming back in today. If you don't remember, my name is Jeff. I'm going to be working with you on your asylum case. Last time we talked about how you kind of got into this country and made sure that we had an accurate record of those kinds of things. Today, we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the things that brought you here. You know what I mean? Every single time you interact with someone, they should have, at the beginning, a totally clear understanding of what's going to be happening during that time and how long it's going to take. All too often, There's a great essay by a woman named Molly Crabapple, where she talks about going with immigrants to their immigration court cases, and she has this beautiful line about how to be an immigrant is to wait, and it is often to wait for an indefinite amount of time. So anything you can do to make those parameters definite, I think is really, really powerful and important. When I do this live, I have people practice. I imagine most of you are in your respective offices. So when you can, though, I highly recommend practicing the AIDIT breakdown with someone who's not, of the cloth, as it were, who's not a clinician, who's not an attorney. Practice your rap with friends and family and see how it lands with them, because that's the sort of person you're going to be talking to more often than not. Right. So here's some other good reminders. Some of these don't quite apply in this context. Privilege and confidentiality are the legal statutes and standards that make it so that everything that I say to a client cannot be disclosed. I know as clinicians you have slightly different parameters around that, but I think it is a good thing to review with your client. The kinds of things that would force you to call the authorities, right, which are usually very rare, which are things like, that they're threatening to murder someone or something like that. But let the client know that what they're saying to you is going to be shared probably with their attorney, and maybe with your other fellow lawyers, but no one else. That kind of privacy is very rare, particularly with the case of attorneys. In a lot of countries, attorneys are very much an arm of the court. So letting people know that you are very much on their side and you have an ethical obligation to keep their secrets is a very important thing to say very early on and reaffirm often. Also, like I said before, giving back any sense of control is incredibly important. Just letting people be aware of their options and that this is not a forced situation. Notes on translation. I try and keep, when I'm working with a translator, it to about 10 to 30 second clips, because otherwise the conversation, I can miss a lot of details and people wind up summarizing. I also always let my translators know that I need an exact translation. Very often translators feel some guilt in using terms of derision and gendered insults and homophobic insults when they're recounting the stories that my clients have been through. I like to make sure that they understand that I do actually need those exact insults. They have legal significance as to what exactly was said and when. Okay. So key points, we are creating an experience for our clients. This is a kind of immersive theater. We have to consider everything: how we look, how our offices look, the kinds of vibes and the kinds of effects. Again, this might be pretty standard fare for clinical practice, but you'd be surprised as to how many attorneys will let their office look like a whirlwind of paperwork under fluorescent light and then don't understand why their clients feel so nervous when they walk in there, right? So the more people know about what's happening, the calmer they are, the more capacity they have, right? Like, this is more than anything else something I try and make sure that a lot of the folks that I work with and as an attorney and try and help them understand. Also, that it's okay to repeat things. In fact, it's often necessary. Going back to some of those early points, people's brains literally shut off during some of our discussions. So just reminding people about important dates, important situations, this is very necessary in the practice. Right. So any questions that are terribly pressing now? I'm going to open up the thing. I'm not seeing any questions. I'm going to presume that's a good thing. Chat. Boom. No questions so far? No questions so far. All right, let me keep it moving. There we go. Oh, there we go. All right, doing the thing. How to ask about the unspeakable. So I make sure to acknowledge, because a lot of these questions I have to ask because of their legal connotations, and the fact that I'm often preparing people to be cross-examined or examined by asylum officers or cross-examined by trial attorneys. The people that work for ICE is basically prosecutors in immigration cases. But there's a lot of stupid and terrible questions that we're going to have to ask. And the reason that I make sure that attorneys who are doing this kind of work know that these are stupid and terrible questions, because there's no surer way to show that you cannot be trusted than to ask someone why they didn't go to the police. it betrays a dangerous level of naivete. I think that if you cannot imagine why someone would be frightened to go to the police, you probably shouldn't be working in this field, to be frank. I think that asylum seekers kind of by their very nature have a well-founded fear of government oppression, or that their government is unwilling or unable to stop people from oppressing and persecuting them. So wondering why people didn't go to a potentially persecutorial body to ask for help is a ridiculous question. We have to prepare our clients for these kinds of questions. But in that preparation, not only do we establish trust, but sometimes it actually leads to very fruitful lines of inquiry. So I have a colleague and very good friend, Claire Thomas, who works for the New York Law School Asylum Clinic. She deals with a lot of cases of special immigrant juvenile status. So young people who are in the family court system, usually getting a guardian or in foster care, have the option and the ability to adjust their status eventually to become a green card holder through this mechanism called special immigrant juvenile status, kind of a hybrid of immigration and family law. So she works with a lot of people from the Northern Triangle, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, where they deal with an awful lot of gang violence from the MS-13, who work as kind of a parallel government. They either control directly or have the police completely terrified of them. So asking a 13-year-old who was forced to join a gang, why, or tried to be, was attempted to be forced to join a gang, why they didn't go to the cops is a stupid question and a terrible one, because it's going to be really obvious to them. They're also going to be really confused why you don't understand that. Now, asking them, clients, young person, I totally understand. I'm familiar with the situation. I know why you didn't go to the police, but can you tell me in your own words why you didn't go to the police? It's something that will come up. The asylum officer or the trial attorney is going to ask that of you. And lo and behold, like, she's gotten answers before by asking that question in that way, where, the young person, also lived a 2-mile walk through the hills from the nearest police station. So now they have more information to add to their affidavit and declaration, but they wouldn't have got there if they hadn't sort of asked that question to begin with, if they just would have presumed they knew why they didn't go to the police, right? So it's a good question to ask, but you need to preface it. Also, part of what I have to do as an attorney, this may or may not apply in your clinical practice, part of my obligation in order to get someone asylum, to show that they have a well-founded fear of persecution, is to show that there is a nexus, a connection between who they are, their race, their political beliefs, their religion, their sexual orientation, their gender identity, and the violence that they have suffered. It is not enough to have been raped. You have to have been raped for a particular reason. This has to do with a lot of the perverse ways in which we understand rape and sexual assault in our country generally, particularly within our asylum system. Now, one of the worst things about my job is there's no way to ask someone about the motivations of their rapist and not make them feel partially responsible for their rape. I think that anytime you're asking someone to imagine why it happened to them, our brains automatically attribute that issue to a personal failing, particularly if we've experienced sexual violence. It's also, and this is just like the hill that I am absolutely willing to die on all the time in a legal context, it's a pointless question because every sexual assault is a political act. It requires that someone be seen as not human or less than human in order for it to happen. Armed robbery doesn't really require that in quite the same way. You can go into a bank and want the money and be willing to hurt someone in order to get that money, but your relationship to the money and the person you're harming is fundamentally different than during a sexual assault. Because you would just assume get that money, more often than not, without all of the armed robbery. It's the money that they're really after. In the case of sexual assault and rape, it is the degradation of that individual that is the point of the action. Also, in a patriarchal culture like that we exist in, a raped male body is a queered male body. And so regardless of whether or not someone identifies as gay or queer or bisexual, from being sexually assaulted, they are ostensibly viewed that way in the larger culture. If that doesn't feel accurate to you, I encourage you to read some of what the young men who came forward after being sexually assaulted by Catholic priests, when they came forward in the 80s, in the 90s, their testimony is widely available online, as well as other experiences from male-identified and male-assigned at birth people who have been the victims of sexual assault. They are ostensibly queered because of this experience. And so that we are forced to ask these questions as attorneys, I think, it's so frustrating to me because it is doing such damage and such violence to my client. And yet I have to ask these questions. I have to establish this nexus. So I do everything I can to harm reduce that experience. But I am very cognizant that I am causing harm every time I am asking that kind of question. Just waiting on the next slide. Very slow internet. There we go. All right. So I always like to start with the easy stuff. Start with the questions that are easy to answer. During the first interview, I usually just confirm biographical data. I know some of that may or may not apply to your practice. And then in subsequent interviews, I like to confirm details. So time, date, weather are the ones that I usually confirm. If they can't remember the date, I start with the season and then go before or after the holiday. Oh, God, I mean, it must have happened in like 2013. Okay, 2013, great. Was it winter, spring, summer? Oh, it was winter. Winter, okay, great. Was it before or after Christmas? I think it was just before, right? So now you have a much narrower date field to draw from. This was on or about November, December 2013, right? I also like to remember always, and this will come back again later, that everyone is more than the worst things that have happened to them. I like to start with a daily routine that is not connected to the trauma. It also helps reorient the client in their in that experience, in that moment when they were dealing with these things, and gives you a much broader sense as to who they are. This will also come up again later. Also, food tells a lot. Consider what you can deduce by someone's grocery list, right? So talking about the kinds of food that people would eat, whether or not they had a home-cooked meal, this will tell you an awful lot about who they are and what they were dealing with, outside of the discrete trauma that is the nexus or the basis of the case. So I always like to ask questions that are rooted in the physical lived experience of my clients. This, again, may be sort of like second nature to y'all, but it is not to attorneys. Attorneys like to ask things like, were you trafficked or a victim of human trafficking? Did you experience domestic violence? It's been my experience that even people who've experienced horrible domestic violence do not personally identify as victims of domestic violence. That's not kind of egocentric. It's not how it works. So these are from an emergency room protocols for dealing with people who may have been trafficked. Ask questions like, are there locks in the doors to the windows where you work or where you sleep? Did you have permission to eat, sleep, or use the bathroom? Was your identification taken from you? These are indicators legally of someone being trafficked for labor purposes or for sex work or for other kinds of labor. But they'll tell you an awful lot more than were you trafficked, were you abused, right? So, was intimate partner violence present in your relationship with your former spouse is a bad question. What was it like when he would come home after work is a good question, right? Rooted in the physical lived experience of the person in front of you. So when discussing the traumatic episode, I usually like to start about 6 hours before the episode. It gives background to the incident and helps reorient the witness, the client, to the episode, as I said before. Also, we make judgments according to the context of the questions we are asked. So if I ask you to describe your wedding or the birth of your child, you'll order the information based on what you think I think is most important, depending on the context, right? So your doctor is going to hear a different story about your childbirth than your mother-in-law. However, if I ask you to just tell me about that day, not what was that thing like, but what was that day, the answer is going to be much more expansive. It's going to walk us through all the way up until the thing that is sort of often the nexus of the case. What happened next is always a good question. And I also like to always make sure to ask what happened after the incident. It gives a kind of narrative closure to the event in a way that adds credibility, particularly for people reading the story for the first time. I also think it is incredibly important to always signal to your client that whatever they did to survive the event was the correct response. My clients come to me with so much shame, they are drowning in it. And letting them know that they did the right thing, even if they feel terrible about all of it, gives them at least some sense of control and can help lessen the burden that they feel because of what they've been through and what they have survived and the people that they're close with that are not able to be applying for asylum outside of harm's way. All right, so helping your client get grounded. This, again, might be very similar or very familiar to clinicians, but, I draw a lot from work around somatic therapies. I really believe that you have to help people identify that they are no longer in physical danger and help integrate cognitive behavioral therapy techniques into practice. So I have people, identify the rainbow colors in the room, list the trains that they took and the routes they took to get here, like anything to help them kind of reorient to where they are. And I help explain to clients that what's happening right now is some of that like neuropsych stuff, that parts of their brain are freaking out right now because it feels exactly like they're going through that horrible traumatic thing again. So trying to help them reorient physically to what is going on, that they're no longer in that degree of danger, does a lot more than just telling people that they're safe. Deciding whether or not you're safe is a very higher order function. And that's something that is not often able to do when executive function is impaired. Right. Always like to plan for what's next, right? Where are they gonna go today? Do they need anything? When will I see them again? Like what's happening in the meantime? What are the next steps for the lawyer, right? Again, like understanding where they are, what they need. I always invite people to hang out in my lobby and charge their phones and just take a breath before they have to go move on, right? Like doing everything you can to make sure that they are leaving this very, very difficult experience with a sense of control. Funny, I'm thinking of it just now. I had a really intense session with a therapist once, and he was running late for his next session. And, I just walked out onto the street like an open wound, and it definitely contributed to some breakdown between myself and that clinician. End of the interview is the best time. This is usually a lawyer thing to photocopy documents. And also small talk is no small thing. You might remember earlier in Act 1, Scene 2, where I made a joke about Pinky in the Brain, and hopefully that joke resonated with some of my Gen X millennial or maybe even baby boomer who watched the cartoons, watched the Animaniacs with their kids growing up. There's a beautiful quote by John Steinbeck in a letter that he wrote to his doctor, which is the most John Steinbeck-y thing ever. It's like 2,000 words long. And he has this line about how he wants in a doctor a friend with special skills. He wants someone who is able to help him. How does he describe it? It's as if we were deep sea diving, and if I were with you, you would want me to show you the wonders and perils that could await us, or something to that effect. Clinicians, you have a bit more training in this regard, but lawyers often think they need to be law robots. And what I hopefully did in making a random cartoon reference, as well as like talking about my mother-in-law and her adorable idiosyncrasies, would show that I'm a human being with a context outside of the room that we're sitting in. By doing so, I am tacitly acknowledging that you are a human being with context outside of the room that you are just sitting in, that you exist beyond just this discrete trauma. And that, I think, builds the kind of relationship that is not only essential for an effective asylum case or an effective immigration case to move its way forward, but is also really, really essential for clinicians and attorneys to deal with the vicarious trauma that we are experiencing, is to work with our clients not as three-dimensional, fully embodied human beings. And while that does make the things that they go through feel all the worse, it also, I think, strengthens our connection to broader humanity and contextualizes the importance of the work that we're doing in, so that it doesn't just become, the cross that we bear, that we lug around. There will be more on that later. All right. So other good reminders. Again, most of these things really apply to attorneys and may or may not be relevant to you as clinicians, but I like to make sure attorneys get comfortable with uncomfortable silences. So I like to make sure attorneys understand that after they ask a question, they should give a solid 10 count before doing a follow-up, like ask a question and then go. Right? So like a good solid 10 count before asking a follow-up question to let that person be able to like form a response. Again, always be aware of reactions. There's a clinician that I work with here at ADP. They got a great line about how you're allowed to cry in a session, but not more than the client, right? Like we have to hold it together in a way that our clients do not have to, because that's what they have us for. I like to say thank you as often as possible and acknowledge how hard it is to disclose what's going on. I try to remember that they may have told this story many times or never before, so their reactions may be very intense or completely numb. I also like to remember that adrenaline affects different people in different ways, and that we are people as clinicians, as attorneys, and we get huge surges of adrenaline from doing this work. Okay. A note on lies and non-disclosures, I'm blanking on the term, but clinicians also have a term for it when people are faking their symptoms for whatever reason. So this comes up a lot with lawyers. Lawyers often complain, "Oh my God, my client lied to me again. Oh my God, why didn't my client tell me they had an arrest record?" Blah blah blah. So controlling information is an essential survivor skill for everyone. You know, just ask Zuckerberg, right? I'm sure we're all really disturbed as to how much information about our lives exists, you know, in a cloud somewhere that may or may not be secured, right? If you're an LGBTQ person or a person who's from an abusive family dynamic, lying to your primary caregivers has kept you alive. I can tell you personally, as a bisexual person who has experienced sexual violence as a child, my ability to convince people around me that I was not who they thought I was and I had not been through the things that I had was how I kept myself safe. And so I became an incredible liar because of it and got really, really good at controlling information and kind of manipulating people around me and making sure that they understood about me what I wanted them to. So we need to make absolutely clear why we are asking every question we are asking, particularly as attorneys. As clinicians, you have a little bit more deference, I think, but I think it's still important to be able to justify why you're asking a particular question. Also, not all identities are visible. Just because it's not part of the legal claim doesn't mean it doesn't exist. If, attorneys say something cute about like drug addicts or, persons who've had interact with the criminal punishment system, they may be burning bridges of trust and not even realize what they're doing. Because you have to tell someone a million times that they can trust you, but you only need to show them that they can't once. Also, trauma affects memory. Sometimes it's something you could have said. I have a client who is she's a trans woman from Guyana. She has endured an incredible amount of violence in her life. The night before our asylum interview, she told me about a situation in which one of her friends went on a date with a police officer. That police officer beat her friend to death because her friend was queer or trans. And this is exactly the kind of information I would have loved to put into a declaration that I had submitted a week before to the asylum office. Now, mind you, this client had originally come into my office answering to a different name, using different pronouns, mostly seeking asylum based on her LGBT or on her HIV status, but like eventually told me her real name. We became much, much closer and became incredibly close throughout the process of working together. I don't think she was messing with me or trying to make my job more difficult. Quite the contrary. I think that she had experienced so much violence in her life that until that moment, it had really not occurred to her. It was really not even in the top 10 worst things that had ever happened. So we just have to remember when we're dealing with people who've experienced tremendous trauma, going back to the slide from John Allen, is that they may rank their traumas differently than we rank their traumas. Some things might not be just that big of a deal to them, even though they are exactly what we need for our legal case that we're working on. All right. Also, this is from Dr. Blasey Ford's testimony in front of Congress. I feel like this, oh no, I'm getting an additional call, so I'm going to decline this. Okay, there we go. All right, hopefully I didn't hang up on anyone. I'm looking. Okay, it looks like, sorry, I got a phone call on my phone. I want to make sure I didn't lose connection. I think I'm good. I'm going to keep going. Sarah's not pinging me, so I'm going to keep it moving. All right, so note on the lines of non-disclosures. So this is from Supreme Court Justice Kavanaugh's appearances for the Senate. This is Dr. Blasey Ford, who you see down there in the blonde. And you see before you a bunch of people who probably don't think of themselves as being antagonists. I'm sure maybe the two gentlemen on the end, are clear about how they're seen. But the two gentlemen in the middle and the prosecutor, who was a Special Victims Bureau prosecutor in Arizona, probably think that they're asking a very straightforward, honest question. I'll give them the benefit of the doubt. They actually thought that this was a legitimate hearing and one in which someone could come forward and discuss the nature of what was going on. But I think it's really important to realize, again, how we're seen in these situations and how we show up. And attorneys, how similar our costumes are to the four gentlemen, and how maybe our sort of resting lawyer face may telegraph to us or telegraph to our clients something that we wish that they didn't see. All right. Keep it moving so we don't have to look at that picture anymore. Come on. Come on. Oh, there we go. Sorry. Boom. There we go. All right. LGBTQ specific issues. Okay. This, again, more has to do with lawyers than y'all. But please remember that as much as precedent and sometimes cultural norms equate gender identification and sexual orientation to a quasi-racial diagnosis, I'm here for white America, for Black America, for gay America, and for straight America. It's like, well, those identities have a lot of Venn diagrams, right? Race is very different than gender orientation or sexual identity, because even if you are a very straight, heterosexual identifying cisgender, that's people who identify with the gender that they were assigned at birth. So like the kind of not the opposite of trans, but like ostensibly the opposite, the counter to trans. Even if you are cis and straight and comfortable in your sexuality and your gender identification, and have always been, that gender identification and sexuality has changed throughout the course of your life. You have evolved. Hopefully you are not the same at 15 as you are at 50, right? Otherwise something has gone terribly, terribly wrong. You may wind up in front of the Senate screaming about how you like beer like an entitled child. I don't know. Just going to throw that out there. It's important to recognize that even though in an asylum case, I try and make this clear to lawyers, we have to sort of take a picture of someone's gender identity and their sexual orientation, and then make sure that that picture is clear enough for them to get reliefs. It's not accurate. Particularly bisexuality and gender nonconformity are huge problems for our legal system, and you go through a lot of hell if you identify in one of those categories and you're trying to convince the federal government that you cannot go back to your country of origin. I've heard asylum officers and judges say things like, oh, well, you're bisexual, why don't you just go back and marry a woman, right? Things like that. So always examine your intake materials, satisfy your curiosity on your own time. Teen Vogue is free on the internet, and you can who would have thought that Teen Vogue is one of my go-to references for people who want just clear breakdowns around some of the medical procedures and sort of the medical aspects that go into dealing with trans issues. Also, plans and safeties of the legal system, so dead names, searches, things like that. Dead name is the term that a lot of folks use when referring to the name that they were assigned at birth, because that name carries with it so much pain from a previous identity. Calling someone by that name it can be a very offensive and a very hurtful thing. Okay, so it's not if, it's when you make a mistake. You should breathe. You should not panic. You should correct yourself, and you should apologize, but not more than twice. After that, you should stop apologizing and move on. Otherwise, you're kind of getting emotional labor or asking for emotional labor out of your client. This is a paraphrase of the Audre Lorde line, but your client knows who's trusting you, which is painful, but let that pain motivate you to do better. Right. So key points here, your question should not sound like a lawyer is asking them, but be prepared to explain why they're legally relevant. In this case, like you should be able to explain at the drop of a hat your clinical theories as to why you're asking certain questions. Especially if you're seeing people who are referred to you for like clinical diagnoses and maybe not out of like an ongoing like supportive role, right? Like why you need to know a thing for the affidavit that you're writing to the lawyer is a good thing to be able to explain. Telling the story of a traumatic incident triggers the same responses as living through the traumatic incident. We have to act accordingly. Also, your clients are not trying to trick you for fun. They are terrified and maybe don't trust you, and maybe they're not wrong for that. So we always need to be reaffirming and rebuilding trust. Questions? Keep moving because we're almost to the point where we're asking questions generally. The checklist seems like a good time to review. So before the interview, always think about the physical experience of the room so they understand what is happening and why. Also, how can you make this experience better? Also, do your questions call for answers rooted in the physical experience of your clients? And do your clients understand why you are asking them? Also, after the interview, how are they feeling? Do they know where they are going and what they need to keep going? Do they know what's happening next? And how are you feeling? We don't have a lot of the same kinds of emotional supports built into our reflective practice that y'all do. So I have to make sure that lawyers understand that they're taking on a big burden when they do this kind of work, and it leaves a big mark. We're going to get into more of that in a moment. Oh, sorry, I have my phone is going to be making noises at me in a moment. Sorry. So during the interview, this slide is left intentionally blank. I don't think, like during the interview, we should just show up like people. We should just show up in our full selves. We should just show up for the person in front of us and try and give them whatever they need. We should not rely on our notes. If the interview doesn't go as well as planned, we'll go back later and figure out how to do another interview. But like while the thing is happening, we have to just maintain presence in that moment. All right. I take a drink of water and crack a window in this room because it's awfully warm, at least where I am. But then I'm going to talk a little bit of how to sustain. No, darn it. Come on, there we go. Messing up my dramatic situation here. Come on. Ow. Stop. There we go. Okay, how to sustain. Taking a drink of water. Give me 1 second. Hopefully the rain is not too loud on you. Okay, so how to sustain, because suffering in the world is infinite, but we are not. So like I said, I've been doing high-intensity trauma work for about 20 years now. It's definitely left a mark on me. And I have no intention of stopping anytime in the near future. I feel like I cannot at this point with how much need there is and how dangerous it is in the world today for the people that I represent and I have the honor of supporting. So what do we do about all of these horrible things? Again, some of this might be already incorporated into your practice as clinicians, but I talk to a lot of lawyers who don't. So this is kind of oriented towards them, but hopefully there'll be some good things in here that you can pick up as well. So here's a list of signs of compassion fatigue. I'm sure many of you are familiar. This to me is like, in bingo, when you don't just, it's not just the bingo, but like the whole blackout of the whole board, just pervasive hopelessness, aches and pains, fear, helplessness, all these things. This is, any given day that ends in Y for me. I think it has a lot to do with toxicity in our larger culture. Sorry, my kerning is a little messed up here, but we live in an anti-relational, vulnerability despising culture, one that not only fails to nurture skills of connection, but actively fears them, right? I'm sure you as clinicians are pretty cognizant of that. But also legal culture is particularly bad with this. This is a quote from a woman who runs the Lawyers Assistance Program in Kentucky. There are a lot of high-stress professions. Being a physician has stress. However, when a surgeon goes into a surgical suite to perform a surgery, they don't send another physician to try and kill the patient. In the legal profession, adversity is the nature of our game. Lawyers fight. That's what we do. And that's really, really stressful. It's even more stressful in immigration culture. This is from Judge Dana Marks, who was an immigration attorney. This is her quote in 2014 about how immigration court cases amount to death penalty cases held in a traffic court setting, which is very, very true. The lack of due process, the lack of assigned counsel. You're not entitled to an attorney in immigration matter the way you are in a criminal matter. Also, we don't talk enough about, as immigration attorneys, what it means to do death penalty cases in a traffic court setting and volume, and the kind of damage that does to us. So we also have a situation where we are practicing law against an adversary that does not have any respect for the rule of law. I can tell you as a person who was present at the protests at JFK, who has had several clients lose legal rights because of decisions that attorney generals under the Trump administration have made, who regularly deals with opposing counsel who is so obviously unconcerned with the safety of my clients. 22 people have died in ICE custody in the last 2 years. So that's 22 human lives ended while they were detained by Immigration and Customs Enforcement, usually for lack of medical care. So if ICE were a serial killer, right, ICE would put up Ted Bundy numbers. That's the equivalent of what a Ted Bundy did at certain points. And what this does is creates a moral injury. You may have heard this term before. Follow the link there, and there's a great rant about what this means. But when you represent a system, which we in effect do as clinicians and healthcare providers and lawyers, when that system is so violently disrespectful to our clients and what they've been through and the very nature of the system that we claim to represent. I was not a spring chicken when I became an attorney. I was not new to this. I was true to this. I became an attorney after getting really sick and tired of watching 16-year-olds get their heads bounced off of the metal picnic tables in Rikers Island by corrections officers, and having those corrections officers look at me like there was nothing that I was going to do about it, because there wasn't. I took out $300,000 in student loans and am now feel like I'm playing chess against a pigeon. I have all these clever procedural moves and techniques and ways of trying to get people some relief, but the pigeon just wants to knock over the pieces and shit on the table, right? I'm not dealing with somebody who respects my position in any way, shape, or form. In fact, I am referred to as a dirty immigration lawyer, and I am regularly told that I am in fact lying when I talk about the terrible things that my clients have gone through. And this creates a moral injury. I say this because I feel like to always put it on burnout or put it on an individual that we're somehow not capable of dealing with these kinds of stressors is to blame the victim. There are things we can do to help take care of ourselves and help deal against this, but this is a systemic problem. This needs systemic solutions. And often that is above ourselves or our supervisor's pay grade, but we need to be clear about that it's happening. Otherwise, we're just enabling an abusive dynamic. So that gets into vicarious trauma, which is a term that a lot of you as clinicians may be familiar with. So it's the situation where, the stories and the trauma described by our clients start rubbing off on us, right? We avoid thinking or talking about the trauma that's affected us. Sometimes we're in a persistent arousal state. I oscillate between the two. I try and make it a Monday, Wednesday, Friday thing, but it doesn't always work out that way. Yeah, very real. But there's also vicarious resilience, which is the unique and positive effects from watching people go through a recovery process. I am truly honored by the work that I'm able to do. And in many ways, I have been able to heal a lot of the things that I've been through, and that I simultaneously fight other people's monsters and my own demons. I wouldn't want to do any other thing at this moment in history, but the way that I'm able to kind of keep a good attitude directly has to do with those attributes that are attributed to vicarious resilience, right? So that's like connection with the client's growth and empathetic attunement with my client. Lawyers are not really good at this, so I'm going to talk for a moment about how lawyers can help foster those connections. So the work is to feel more, not less, right? As Thich Nhat Hanh points out. If you pour a handful of salt into a cup of water, it becomes undrinkable. But if you pour that same salt into a river, people continue to draw from it and cook and wash and drink, because the river is an immense and has the capacity to embrace and transform. Oftentimes lawyers, and I would imagine some clinicians, shrink themselves. They try and just keep it at work. They try and minimize the effect that is going on, and I think that is the exact wrong direction to go. I also think that it's really important to recognize that people are more than the worst things that have happened to them. So if you're not familiar with the grammar of Twitter, this tomato Ishoka, whoever it is, this first quote in the box is being responded to by the person of absurdist words, the 5'7" black male that is responding to it, who is saying that if you want to know how sincere your advocacy is, do you spend time outside of your advocacy with the members of the groups that you are speaking for? It is really, really important that we see and we recognize our clients as three-dimensional human beings and not just these snippets of trauma that we digest like television episodes. I think it's important that my internet connection start working more effectively, because it really messes up my whole dramatic layer here. So sorry, friends. So sorry. Okay. And dwell on here. Oh. Come on. Come on. I have a cursor. Oh my goodness, this is terribly, terribly frustrating. I really apologize. Don't know what's happening with my computer. It's frozen up. I'm on remote desktop.
Jeff, if you'd like, this is Sarah, and you can keep speaking without the slides. Hopefully, when it unfreezes, we can forward them to the right point.
Oh, okay, I appreciate that. Yeah, I'm literally not able to, like. There we go. Come on. There we go. All right, how about this? Come on. Can we do the thing here? Slide projector. Can we do it? Oh my goodness. Come on, remote desktop. Come on. Oh my goodness. I really apologize, everyone. Technical difficulties. Yeah, and I don't think there's even anything you can do on your end, Sarah. This is 100% my system.
Yes, if you email me your slides, I can show them on my screen.
Okay, great. Okay, so I hopefully will be able to reconnect here in a moment. I don't know if everyone is watching this now, but are you seeing that as well, Sarah? Connection to the desktop was lost, negotiating credentials.
I'm seeing find a way to count your wins.
Oh, there we go. Wonderful. All right, there we go. All right, finally works. Cool. So yeah, so find a way to count your wins. This particularly is relevant for attorneys. So this is Claire Thomas, who works at the New York Asylum Clinic, who's posted there. And then the string, the thumbtacks are the clients that have come through that clinic, and then the strings are folks who have won their cases. So eventually, it's going to have this really beautiful kind of spider web motif. This is mine. I also have a label maker, and I leave myself little notes like, "You are not crazy. You are not alone." And every time one of my clients wins asylum, we put a rock in the box. I get like rocks or semi-precious stones or crystals. And I've actually even made a ritual of doing this with my clients. I'll show them the box when we start the process. I'll show them the box right before they go for their interview, and they put a rock in the box at the end there, and it really helps bring literal closure sometimes to this incredibly painful moment in their life, and lets them kind of know that like there's a solemnification. Their story lives somewhere. It lives in this office. It's honored. It has kind of its own grave site. So I think therapists should also do those things. Also, I'm a big believer in sharing wholesome memes and getting tattoos. If you do the Googles on me and see me, I have 2 sleeves of tattoos. But something I think has been really powerful in the era of social media is when people go on Facebook or Twitter, or even LinkedIn, and talk and like say that they're having a rough time and that they need some help and that they would love just some cat memes. And people will respond with just all of these different, adorable kittens sleeping on their back and, raccoons popping bubbles in the bathtub and stuff like that. I think it does a very powerful thing in meeting people where they're at in terms of the kind of help that they're able to get in that moment and showing a kind of community support. And I highly recommend doing it. And I also really recommend, particularly with like hard cases. So I work a lot with the New Sanctuary Coalition. And if you Google Robbie Ragbeer, you can see he was nearly deported by ICE against the law. And he was basically kidnapped. One of the city council members, Johnny Williams, was beaten up by a police officer in that altercation. He's now a public advocate, Johnny Williams. But a bunch of us from the New Sanctuary Coalition went out and got tattoos. And it was a great way to kind of put somewhat of a closure point on that experience and create a way for us to really bond and recognize and know that we had all kind of been through something collectively. So key points: if you feel like there's something that is very, very wrong, that feeling is correct. The world is a very, very dangerous and a very difficult place right now. But you cannot fight the feeling of inhumanity by feeling less. You have to feel more. I know that the answer has something to do with us all acknowledging the toll that this is taking and then showing up for one another when it's taking that toll. To that end, I'm going to answer questions afterwards for a few minutes here, but here's all of my information. I'm going to give Sarah a copy of this presentation. Please let people know if I can help, if they feel like that this would be kind of thing would be helpful to them. And I thank you so much for your attention and your time today. I got about 10 minutes if people want to type in questions and I can talk them through. Or I can close up shop.
Yes, we have time. So I've already answered a few logistical questions for people. We are going to send the slides and a link to this recorded webinar afterwards, so everyone will get a copy of those.
Wonderful, wonderful. All right, I'm not seeing any other questions on the chat. Yeah. Let me, while we're waiting here, I'll send this to you right away. All right, escape that. There we go. Hopefully you won't. Sorry, some random people trying to contact me on Facebook. That was that was some of the noises that y'all were hearing. I really appreciate your patience. This is a PDF. All right, and then I will spare you all the embarrassment, or I'll spare myself the embarrassment of you looking at my very, very messy inbox. But yeah, I'll send that to Sarah momentarily.
Oh, we did get a new question.
Oh, sure.
How do you see the current political situation affecting how we proceed?
With extreme caution. This is the shortest answer. I mean, it's really bad. If anyone would like to know exactly how brutal and violent, it's more than I have the time to go into now. Our current administration is, but I will tell you, both professionally and personally, you know, they've already built the wall, like it's in immigration court. I do not. I believe wholeheartedly that the administration is enthusiastically homophobic and enthusiastically racist. I think that Donald Trump and Mike Pence maybe oscillate between, you know, if they care more about hurting LGBTQ folks or hurting people of color, but they bounce back between the two. That's been obvious by pretty much every professional breath that those two have taken throughout their lives. We've had a kind of rot within our legal system for a very long time with regards to systemic racism and homophobia. And, you know, the laws that were passed under Clinton in 1996 and the deportation and detention apparatus that came about under Obama is what is facilitating what is happening right now. But it's nothing short of preparing a mass atrocity on a genocidal level. I think you can look at the way that this administration treated Puerto Rico, as well as what has happened during some of the other like disasters during the summer and during the summers, to really understand how precarious the lives are of the people who are in the immigration detention camps that are created. You know, you're in a camp in the middle of the desert. You're one large storm or heat wave away from thousands of people dying. And the administration does not care. Again, they have killed, I would go so far as to say murdered 22 people in their custody. I feel like legally that's not too much of a stretch. If I were to take one of your loved ones and I were to put them in a cell with no medical help for fun, you would call me a murderer. I think that just because people do that under the color of law, that doesn't change the inherent fact that they did. Yeah, I mean, this is what it was. This is what it's like right before very serious authoritarianism takes over, and there's massive crimes against humanity. There have already been many, and there doesn't really seem to be any stopping them. I think you can't look at this administration without using a kind of intimate partner violence lens. And if any of the people on this call have ever had any experience, either personal or professional, with people in those kinds of situations, abusers don't really go down without a fight. So yeah, it's a bad time. Say all that to say, I am regularly thrilled, honored, surprised, given more fortitude. I can't conjugate fortitude right now. But the amount of people that say never again and mean it, the amount of people that I've met who are not lawyers, who are not clinicians, who are just very regular human beings. Check out the New Sanctuary Coalition, NYC Sanctuary, or if you just Google New Sanctuary Coalition, it'll come up very quickly. They run an accompaniment program where volunteers go and they go with people to their immigration proceedings. And I'm just always amazed, and I'm very harmed by how a lot of regular people will show up. And despite the good people on both sides narrative that winds up creating the impression that the split is actually 50-50, that's not the case. We have a minority political rule in this country where a very small group of people have an inappropriate amount of political power, and that's what's creating the situation. If you look at the polling that's done across the board, by and large, Americans do not think that we should be torturing people. They do believe that there should be some way through for people who do not have status, and that we do have certain inalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So I think that it is a dark time, but there have been other dark times, and I draw a lot of strength from the people who lived and fought through slavery, and lived and fought through Jim Crow, and lived and fought through the Holocaust. What hurts a lot is the knowledge of how many people are not going to make it, and are not going to survive this time. But I do believe that humanity will survive, and that human beings will survive, and that eventually, you know, the moral arc of the universe will bend towards justice. It's just about, if we're at the time of Schindler's List, it's just about making that list as long as possible, and knowing that the people who made that list will eventually fall. So that is my radical motivational speech for y'all today.
I feel very motivated.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It is, well, at least according to my clock, it is 2:31. So I know we have to wrap up, but I will send a PDF of the slides and a link to the recorded webinar on Spicky's YouTube page to everyone who RSVP'd and or attended. And I'll also send a link to the new Sanctuary Coalition. And Jeff, anything else you would like to send out, feel free to send to me. And thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thank you all so much. Have a great day.
Bye.